Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and press the notification bell. Don't forget to check out Locals and subscribe and support. It's help from viewers like you that keep this channel going for all the content. All right, so Terminal Philosophy and I are finishing our four-part series on the Second Punic War. It's been a whirlwind. We had to cover 17 years of war. This is the World War II of antiquity, the largest conflict of its kind in antiquity. Arguably, a million people died. If you look at all the battlefield deaths, naval deaths, deaths due to cities being destroyed, deaths due to crops being destroyed. I mean, this really is just the largest military conflict in antiquity, and probably the largest military conflict up until, the 30 Years' War in Europe. I mean, it's just massive. These sorts of numbers we just don't see. So we're going to begin with the remnants of the Italian campaign. So where we left off was the Roman victory at Metaurus, which leaves Hannibal essentially isolated permanently. He withdraws to Bruttium and just sort of holds out there. So what we see as the strategic perspective is Hannibal is trying to recapitulate the tactics of his father Hamilcar in Sicily. So when Hamilcar goes to Sicily at the end of the First Punic War, the war is mostly lost on land. The Romans control most of the territory. His goal is to sort of drag out the conflict with guerrilla attacks and harassing attacks to weaken the Romans and through attrition cause them to throw in the towel. And it seems that Hannibal is resorting to that same broader strategy in Italy now that most of his options are used up. And unsurprisingly, just like his father, it's ultimately not a successful strategy, because what both Hamilcar and Hannibal don't seem to understand is that the Romans don't give up. So the first, major engagement in Italy in this time period is the Battle of Croton in 204-203 BC. This is in Apulia. So earlier, Hannibal had his Numidian cavalry completely wiped out as a garrison force in southern Italy. And so he's left with mostly his core veterans from back in 218 and recruits from Italy, or Greek recruits from Magna Graecia. And so Hannibal and his Bruttian allies, engaged in, bandit raids against the Romans. And so the Romans basically have troops everywhere, and Hannibal can't fight them everywhere, so they eventually undermine his positions in other parts of Magna Graecia. But the Roman goal is still to attack Hannibal directly and defeat his forces. And so Livy records two battles taking place near Croton. So one, we have the Roman consul Publius Sempronius has a marching columns that are attacked by Hannibal. And initially, Hannibal, not much is described of the conflict, but he initially has the better of it, and he kills 1,200 Romans. Now, this engagement was unplanned. These two columns sort of just blundered into each other, and the Romans had already created a fortified camp, which deterred Hannibal from any further attacks. But Publius Sempronius was seeking another engagement with Hannibal in order to efface his defeat. And this time he gets the aid of Publius Licinius Crassus, and he engages Hannibal out with 2-1 odds in his favor. And Hannibal is eventually forced to give ground, giving up and losing 4,000 men and giving up 300 prisoners. Hannibal is then in 203 recalled to Italy to support the campaign against Scipio, and the remaining Carthaginian forces in Italy are defeated by Gnaeus Cornelius Capio, killing 5,000 Carthaginians. But nonetheless, none of them could actually prevent Hannibal from leaving. The other major conflict in Italy takes place in Cisalpine Gaul in 203 in Insubria, where Hannibal's younger brother Mago seeks to recapitulate the strategy of Hasdrubal with similar results. So he sails from the Balearic Islands to Liguria, modern-day Genoa, with 30 ships and 14,000 men. He's reinforced by another 25 ships, 7,000 foot, and 7 elephants. And then he marches into Cisalpine Gaul to recruit the Gaelic tribes. So for the third time, the Gauls of Cisalpine Gaul answer the colors to join Carthage. So they've been tapped out over 17 years by 3 Carthaginian armies recruiting from them. So you can imagine at the end of this conflict, they're just exhausted. He also has his Numidians and no, he negotiates with the Numidians and the Macedonians, and as we'll get to when you get to Scipio later, the Numidians are in the process of changing sides. And so when these diplomatic efforts come up blank, he then decides to just make an attack. The Roman forces under M. Livius and S.P. Lucretius take the defensive position, and then M. Cornelius Cethegus and P. Quintilius Varus lead 4 legions to confront Mago in Umbria, near modern-day Milan. And both the Carthaginian forces and the Roman forces are approximately 30,000 strong. Both are deployed in 2 lines formation. Mago seems to doubt the reliability of the Gallic troops and places them in the rear. And he has his elephants as a reserve. And so in the first issue of the battle in Umbria, his veteran African troops, or Spanish troops rather, are successful against the Romans and push them back. But the Romans then turn his flank with 3,000 horse. He then checks that with his use of elephants, which panic the horse, and then he uses them on the Roman line. But eventually the Romans, having learned how to deal with elephants, countering them with missile fire with the javelins, as we covered in our episode on the elephants many moons ago, they break and run, causing damage to both the Carthaginian lines and the Roman lines. And when the second lines come to play, the Gallic forces are not as reliable, not as disciplined, and the Roman second line defeats them. The key in the ensuing melee, presumably when the Romans deploy their 3,000 horse for their flanking maneuver, Mago is wounded in battle. And at this point, it would seem that from the rest of the battle onward, the Carthaginian army is leaderless, which also explains why it was defeated by the Romans. Because the spirited leadership of the sons of Hamilcar generally are the decisive factor in these battles. So with him being wounded and out of the way, the Romans then win through superior discipline. And then Mago and a remnant of his forces flee back to Africa, where they ultimately join up with Hannibal for their final showdown at Zama. Mago dies on the trip to Africa. So this sort of sums up the entire campaign in Italy. So what are some of your thoughts on the remnants of the Italian campaign?
Right. Well, as you mentioned, with this, the remnants of the Italian campaign can basically be summed up by Battle of Croton, and as well as in Umbria, or in Subria. And basically all the Romans had to do at this point was to continue their strategy of containment. This sort of Fabian strategy had proven to sort of work. It took Rome several years to kind of find their rhythm with this sort of strategy, because they had never gone up against an opponent like Carthage, where they were just repeatedly defeated in pitched battles. But all they had to do was contain Hannibal's power base in the southern portion of Italy. And then, of course, and I don't think that the Romans were fully aware of Hannibal's political situation at home, but Hannibal, as we sort of both agreed in the previous videos on the Second Punic War, basically had his hands tied behind his back, and that will be further exacerbated by the sort of this amphibious invasion of Africa, the part of Scipio and other Roman generals. Yes, as far as the Battle of Insubria goes with Mago Barca, from what I had read, that it was highly likely that Mago was wounded early, and as you mentioned, the Barcas were much of the psychological warfare and the sort of spirited core was centered around the Barca brothers, and so unfortunately for Mago, he was sort of the central linchpin to his army, and without the leadership of the Barcas, the Carthaginians ended up losing about 5,000 men. They lost a lot of officers, and it lost about 22 ensign officers to become prisoners of war. This is all according to Livy, whereas the Romans lost about 2,300. And as I think, but you did a good summary there. I think Cortona and Insubria are basically the last Italian battles for the remaining wars of the Second Punic War.
Now, as we return to Scipio Africanus, clean off his victory in Spain, he has to deal with an extremely entrenched conservatism within the Roman strategy at this point. So Fabius Maximus and Flaccus are still wanting to pursue the Fabian strategy of delay, harassment, and attrition in order to undermine Hannibal's position, because they view Hannibal as the direct threat. Now, given the earlier military defeats in the war that we covered, one can reasonably understand where they're coming from on this. But what Scipio has shown with his victories in Spain is that not only are decisive victories against Carthaginian armies possible, they're necessary to winning the war. Now that Carthage is stripped of its gold and silver supply, it can no longer pay for mercenaries, at least not as easily. And so he sees that the key to getting Hannibal out of Italy is to attack Carthage itself, attack North Africa itself, because he knows that Hannibal will be recalled to defend Africa. And early on, he's elected consul in 205. He's at this point the youngest consul to ever be elected. That's probably another reason why he had opposition from the conservative elements. And so eventually his popularity is so great that he is given the go-ahead to invade Africa. But in order to hamstring his efforts and also fearing a defeat like Regulus at the Battle of Tunis in 255 BC from the First Punic War, because that was the last time Rome invaded Africa. And the Romans said, nightmares of a defeat like that again. They made sure that the only way he could get troops was if they were mercenaries, recruited from allied Romans or from volunteers. The lion's share of the Roman recruits would stay in Italy. The lion's share of the legions would stay in Italy to contain Hannibal. So Scipio is able to get support from Etruria and Umbria. And the other thing that he's able to do is the defeated legions from Cannae and Second Herdonia, which were punished by being sent to Sicily, he is able to recruit in order to bring into his army as a sort of like a redemption arc. You can redeem yourselves by winning the war in Africa. The other thing that he does, and this shows that Scipio is a truly, broad-minded commander, is he understands that the key to Carthage's tactical success is the Numidian cavalry. It was Hannibal's Numidians at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae, which were decisive, and at Second Herdonia, 6 years later, decisive in their defeating of the Romans. And so what's going on is there ends up being a father-son split. The father of Numidian kingdom, Syphax, is wavering between Rome and Carthage. Hasdrubal Gisco offers his daughter Sophonisba to Syphax as a marriage alliance, which causes him to stick with the Romans, or the Carthaginians. But his son, Massinissa, seeing this as an opportunity to claim the throne for himself, decides to ally with the Romans and allies with Scipio. And so at this point, Scipio is able to get 2,000 Numidian cavalry to join his army, as well as the 7,000 volunteers that he brought from Italy, as well as the remnants of the defeated legions that he had from Africa, or that were defeated in Lake Cannae and Second Herdonia. So what we see here is that Scipio is able to use his diplomatic prowess to weaken the Carthaginian base in Africa in order to overcome opposition in Rome itself. And his entire African army is about 35,000 strong, which is quite impressive given the impediments thrown out by the conservative elements of the Senate. And total naval supremacy over the region was secured in 208 BC by Livianus and his victory over the Carthaginians with 40 in 208. And so Scipio only has an escort of 40 quincremes, which is not much, but he doesn't need a whole lot more because the Carthaginian navy is a non-issue even in defending its own waters. And so if we remember from the mercenary war, Utica is important because Utica is the city strategically situated at the isthmus of which Carthage connects to Africa proper. So if you can capture Utica, you can then blockade Carthage from its access to the broader African continent. And so he lands at the city of Utica and tries to besiege it. Now, he's immediately opposed by Hasdrubal Gisco with 13,000 foot and 1,200 horse. He's opposed by Syphax and his forces. Scipio begins to build walls of circumvallation around the city of Utica and is blockading it from the sea with his Roman fleet. But what ends up happening is as he's attacked by the relief column, he's not able to actually hold his position. So he withdraws to winter quarters in the Castor Cornelia and fortifies a narrow promontory, which narrows the front so that he can defend it, and then he's supplied by sea. And at this point, we see that Scipio's original operation begins somewhat inauspiciously. He's trying to recapitulate the coup de main that occurred at New Carthage, but instead he gets bogged down in a siege that he has to then abandon and then take up winter quarters and wait for the next year. So, what are your thoughts, terminal philosophy, on the opening moves of the African campaign?
Right. Well, throughout 206 and 205, Rome had been preparing multiple legions in Sicily, and later the next year in 204, the Roman expedition or the invasion force they had set out for North Africa from Lilybæum, and once they had landed, as you sort of you were getting to, the Romans set about basically ravaging the Bagradus Valley, which is basically sort of the fertile agricultural base for the Carthaginians, specifically places like Utica and Carthage and the surrounding cities and surrounding villages. And after defeating a Carthaginian army, the Romans successfully set siege to the important city of Utica on the coast. Now, what's interesting here is that these various military reverses brought about sort of a political power realignment in Carthage, where these mercantile and big landowners and wealthy sort of merchant classes who had these are folks who had always wished to avoid war with Rome in favor of their own African sort of territorial and commercial interests. And what they ended up doing is they ousted the Barcid faction, and after about 16 years in the wilderness, that's what came to power. Now, what's interesting here is that 30 members of the Council of Elders, superior even to the Senate, they came to prostrate themselves before Scipio. And after blaming everything on Hannibal, they sought these sort of terms of peace. Now, Scipio was sort of in charge of these these peace conditions, and he was considered to be acting with moderation. And Scipio's peace terms were something like all prisoners of war and deserters are to be handed over. All claims to Spain and Mediterranean islands were to be renounced. A substantial indemnity was to be paid, and only about 20 warships could be retained, and the remainder were to be surrendered. So this is just this is kind of underscoring the problems at home that Carthage has always had. Between these various opposing factions. You've got the mercantile class, and then you've got the Barcas, which were successfully campaigning abroad. And Hannibal, honestly, and his brothers really never had the full support that they needed to, especially in southern Italy when Hannibal had, done one of the greatest flanking maneuvers in history. After going through all the Iberian Peninsula, across southern modern-day France, across the Alps, and then, of course, campaigned his way, kicking the Romans' butts all the way down to southern Italy. Throughout that entire process, about 15 to 17 years, he just never had the support he needed from home, because it was just partially because of a lack of military intelligence, and also the mercantile interests of the merchant class at home in Carthage. They just didn't know how long the war was going to go. It was hard to anticipate how successful Hannibal was going to be, but once he had set up his power base, it was a huge failure of the Carthaginians back at the capital to not put their full weight behind Hannibal, to recruit more mercenaries, to send him to establish a stronger naval connection between Carthage and southern Italy. And it's hard to precisely nail down just where the turning point was. Just as sort of the Battle of Midway in the Pacific was sort of the turning point in favor of the Americans, it's a bit difficult to say, at what particular moment Hannibal had lost the initiative in southern Italy due to logistical and political problems from home. But this was basically the setup into Zama. Um, in that same year, in 204, Hannibal had been recalled, and with his arrival, all of those with his arrival, those wishing to prolong the fighting displayed basically this sort of new kind of a truculence. First seizing a number of Roman ships that had been scattered in a storm, and then intercepting and destroying others carrying envoys returning from Carthage. So while these sort of peace terms were in the process, Hannibal didn't want to give up. Rome was his eternal enemy. So anyway, I'll probably leave that as far as a build up towards the conclusive battle of Second Punic War.
Yeah. So as Scipio begins his campaigning in the spring of 203 BC, he wins the decisive battle of Utica. So one of the things that he does is he's outnumbered by the forces of Syphax and Gisco. But one of the things that Scipio does is he at first plays for time by negotiating with both Syphax and Gisco. On the one hand, trying to spread dissension and confusion between the two of them, leading them along. But one of the things that his emissaries are doing is they're also spies. And he finds out that the lodgings of the troops are easily flammable. And so he plans a daring attack at night using fire. So he has the first watch of the night. He sends his cavalry commander Gaius Lelius and Massinissa, half Roman, half Numidian, this cavalry strike force to light fires in Syphax's camp and then attack. So most of these men think that it's just a random fire. They have no idea that a battle's ensuing, and they wake up to put out the fire, and they just get slaughtered. And eventually the fire spreads to the camp of the Carthaginians, and they wake up trying to put out the fire. They end up fighting with the Numidians, thinking that, in the melee at night, and with the Roman forces. And it's a near complete disaster for the Carthaginian and Numidian forces, where most of their troops are destroyed. When Hasdrubal Gisco realizes what's going on, he, with his corps of elite veterans, withdraws from the battle, trying to salvage what he can. And then Scipio rapidly takes the city of Utica, threatening Carthage's overall position. He also knows that as long as the forces of Numidia are allied to Carthage, final victory cannot be assured. And as long as Hasdrubal Gisco has a large military force to operate from the hinterland of Africa, any siege of Carthage or blockade of Carthage is going to be threatened. Now, he does have Massinissa, who is in line for the throne. So he's going to try to kill two birds with one stone by dethroning Syphax and then putting his son in control of the Numidians, therefore assuring their loyalty throughout the rest of the campaign, and defeating Hasdrubal Gisco. So we have the Battle of the Great Plains, or the Bagrades River, and there's another term for it. And so the Romans form up in their typical three-depth formation with cavalry on the wings, the Italian or Roman horses on the right, and Massinissa's horses on the left. Gisco was reinforced by 4,000 Celtiberian warriors who formed the center of the line. Syphax and his Numidians were stationed on the left. The Carthaginian horsemen were on the right. Now, demoralized by previous defeats, the sort of initiative lay with the Roman and Massinissan cavalry rather than Syphax and Gisco, and they broke in the early onslaught of the battle. And then so the Carthaginians were stripped of their defenses. And so in a sort of canaille-like encirclement, the Roman allied horse surround and begin the destruction of the Carthaginian forces. And so then the Celtiberians stand and fight to the death, because technically they can expect no quarter, because many of those tribes had already made peace with Scipio. And Syphax's forces flee, and Gisco and the remnant of his forces flee as well. And so the Celtiberians are cut down to a man. But again, it's another crushing victory by the Romans. And this is immediately followed up by a rapid pursuit in a running cavalry battle in where Massinissa and Lelius are pursuing Syphax to Cirta, which is the capital city of Numidia. And what ends up happening is Syphax tries to raise conscripts to help pad out his army and with the remnants of his veteran forces. And that's no match at all for Syphax or for the Massinissa and the Romans. And so what ends up happening is Massinissa eventually is engaging and skirmishing with his father's forces. And then when Lelius arrives, he overwhelms them. And then Cirta is quickly taken, it surrenders. And now the Romans have completely consolidated control of the Numidians, taking away Hannibal's key advantage. And his Numidians had already died in Italy years earlier. So now Scipio has the real ace card to play, and Gisco's forces are completely scattered. So at this point, he's now consolidated control of Africa. Also, the Great Plains, or Bagrades River, is the great fertile valley area where Carthage grew most of its crops to feed itself. So he could then pursue a scorched earth policy as well to sort of draw Hannibal out from Carthage when Hannibal finally comes. And so he's now in a decisive position to threaten and control the hinterland of Africa. And then this sets everything up for Zama the next year. So what are your thoughts on the African campaign up to this point?
Yeah, that's all correct. And, I jumped the gun a little bit there, but yeah, that was if anything, that was an initial important objective for the Romans, was to land, and then Utica was sort of their first major victory in Africa. However, one of the more important objectives for them was the Bagradus Valley, which was basically the agricultural base for the entire area. So they sort of took a page out of Hannibal's book and were just harassing the logistics and the crucial farmland that fed most of the troops and people in Carthage and the surrounding cities. Yes, and this also underscores the importance of the Numidian cavalry, and with the loss of the Numidians by the Romans, there's no more. I mean, that was basically the bread and butter of the equestrian tradition for the Carthaginians. There was just, at that point, there's just no. They have no cavalry to recruit from, and I mean there are what are loosely referred to as Libyans and other northern African peoples that also had horses, but the Numidians were the ones that the Carthaginians constantly refer to in terms of fielding cavalry. Now, also at this point that. In going after the Bagradus Valley, as you mentioned, that was sort of used as a bait to bring Hannibal out of Carthage to field an army, because the Romans knew now, Scipio Africanus knew that he could defeat Hannibal in a pitched battle, and that's basically the lead up to Zama. But it really began with this harassment in the Bagradus Valley.
Right. Now, in 202 BC, this is the final battle of the Second Punic War, the great showdown between Scipio and Hannibal. Now, at this point, again, it was not clear to either side who would exactly walk away from this victory, in this battle victorious, because Hannibal himself had suffered a few minor reverses in Italy, but had never actually been defeated outright in a battle, but neither had Scipio. So these are essentially two, victorious commanders, with storied campaigns behind them. Now, Scipio had stacked the deck in his favor by consolidating his control of the Numidians. So if we look at Hannibal's forces and Scipio's forces, Hannibal had 36,000 foot and 4,000 horse and 80 elephants. Scipio had 29,000 foot and 6,100 horse. And we see that the Hannibal was reinforced by Mago's troops. Mago had already died. And so the Roman strategy that Scipio had created was the usual, 3-line depth Roman force with one alteration. Knowing that Hannibal would use elephants instead of the checkerboard formation, he had the hastati directly in line, or the principe directly in line with the hastati and triarii, creating columns for which the elephants could then be channeled into. So his overall strategy was that the Weletes would skirmish and disrupt the elephant forces, and if that wasn't sufficient enough, they would then flee through these channels, and then the elephants would be then with the javelins being thrown at them, sort of channeled into these conduits where they would charge harmlessly through the Roman lines and then be surrounded in the back and dispatched. And then he has on his right flank 4,100 Numidian horse led by Massinissa, the fully consolidated Numidian army, and then 2,000, and on his left 2,000 Roman horse led by Lelalius. Hannibal then deploys his army in 3 lines, where the first line are essentially the mercenary troops of Hasdrubal Gisco, or not Hasdrubal, Mago Barca, his brother, basically the first line of cannon fodder. And then he has hastily raised levies as the second line, and then his own veterans are in the third line. And Hannibal is basically hoping that the Romans wear themselves out on the first 2 lines before they come in conflict with his own. And so his overall strategy, since he's inferior in cavalry, has the elephants charge the Roman front line, hopefully disrupt or break it. And if that doesn't happen, then have the elephants, then have his first 2 lines be chewed up in the attrition by the Romans, and then hopefully having his fresh veterans come in, destroy them. That's his plan. And it seems that Hannibal was inspired in part by Zathinippus, because that's how he defeated Regulus. He had his elephants up front, and they just trampled the Roman forces. But at this point, the Romans and Scipio in general had figured out how to counter the elephants. And so while it's a solid strategy against a skilled commander, there are checks for that. And so one of the things that Scipio did to start the battle off was, of course, he blew the trumpets to bring the troops to battle and prepare for the maneuvers, which had the effect of terrifying the elephants in conjunction with the Weletes javelins. And so the elephants crash into the Carthaginian cavalry as they scatter to the rear, and they charge forward and are channeled into the Roman lines that were created for them, and then killed by skirmishers as they come out the back of the Roman lines. Taking advantage of this confusion in the Carthaginian horse on the right and the left, Massinissa and Lelalius attack and drive them off. So for the next segment of the battle, there's no cavalry participating except in a running battle, out of view of the soldiers. And initially it goes well for Hannibal. The Hastati are fighting Mago's mercenaries, and both Livy and Polybius argue that Mago's forces do very well against the Hastati. And then the Principae are switched out, and then they attack, and then they break the mercenary forces, and then the citizen levies of Carthage level their pikes against them, and then the mercenaries are literally not allowed to retreat. They're killed by their own side and by the Romans. And then the Hastati are brought into attacking the citizen levies, and eventually the citizen levies break, and then Hannibal's veteran forces don't let them flee, and they're caught between the 2 forces and killed. I mean, it's a real brutal grind for these frontline Carthaginian forces. Now, given that Hannibal has a superiority in number of infantry, and if this battle of attrition had continued, the battle would have likely gone in Hannibal's favor. What Scipio does do is he then reforms the line, brings out his triarii, and then has the reformed Hastati to make one long line so that he's not outflanked by the Carthaginian forces. And in a battle of attrition like that, the relatively quote-unquote fresh veterans of Hannibal would have likely won. But at the opportune moment in the battle, Massinissa and Lelalius return and completely annihilate the Carthaginian forces by attacking them from the rear. And completely encircled and destroyed, the Romans lose about 5,000 men, and the Carthaginians' defeat is near total, with 40,000 killed or captured. With this defeat, Carthage has literally no chance of winning the war. Even Hannibal recommends that they surrender and make peace. And, Rome now is on the path to universal empire, and, Dido's children are now a trampled corpse. And so we see at this point that there's no more chance. And then so Scipio, when he offers terms to Carthage, they have to give up all their overseas territories in Spain, and they have to give more or less total independence to the Numidians, and they're not allowed to go to war in Africa without Rome's consent, which eventually, when we get to the Third Punic War, the Numidians are taking advantage of this, and then the Romans side with them. They have to pay a large indemnity of 10,000 silver talents. They have to forego the use of war elephants and restrict their warships to 10. So at this point, Carthage is just a prostrate, defeated nation. So what are your thoughts, Terminal Floss?
Well, you're right. I mean, this is the epic, bloody conclusion to the Second Punic War. We're lucky to have at least decent information about this from Livy in terms of sort of the order of battle and how both armies set up their formations. As you said, with the Romans, you have the Hastati in the front, the Principes in the center, and then, well, in the second layer, I should say, and the Triarii are third behind. And then for the Carthaginians, you have the mercenary forces. You basically, and then the second layer, you have this sort of hastily recruited or conscripted sort of citizen portion of the army. And then you have Hannibal and his seasoned veterans from the Italian campaign. And basically what happened is that by this time, as you summarized fairly well, is that the Romans already knew how to deal with elephants just by javelins and by basically frightening elephants. And then they just couldn't break the Roman center. So that was the first problem for the Carthaginians. And the second one is that the cavalry, or I should say the Carthaginian cavalry, was chased off by Numidian and Italian cavalries, like far off from the field of battle. And then the mercenary forces in the front basically got worn down to the point that they could not, they just couldn't compete with the Hastati. And what happens in sort of a reverse of Cannae is the encirclement of Hannibal's army with the Numidian and the Italian cavalry after having successfully chased off the Carthaginian cavalry. They come back down on behind Hannibal and basically close Hannibal in on all sides. Now, Hannibal and several thousand Carthaginians did escape and survive, but this was the end of Carthaginian military might. Yeah, as you mentioned, even Hannibal himself knew that the war was over. Now, here's something interesting, just as sort of a retrospective or kind of a bird's eye view of things, and this is from the Osprey Publishing Essential Campaigns book about the Second Punic War, but I think it's important to quote here, and it says, but what is of interest about Zama is how it demonstrated the interplay between the operational and strategic levels of war. By ravaging the Bagradus Valley, Scipio had drawn Hannibal away from his own secure base into a hostile interior where he had to fight on ground and conditions not of his own choosing. This would have been a difficult operational situation to have created in Italy, but taking the strategic decision to transfer the war to Africa, it was achieved almost effortlessly. So, yes, with that, there's a lot to be said here. But Scipio had basically, I will say, I don't want to say that he just copied a lot of Hannibal's tactics in Italy, but there were certainly a lot of note-taking. And just as that passage basically summarized, that Hannibal was not in his, he wasn't able to dictate the pace of battles and the way battles were fought. Now that was under sort of Roman tempo. So, and then again, with the loss of Numidian cavalry and other Italian cavalry that had once been under Hannibal's influence, that had all been gone now. Now, yeah, there's a lot of blaming and finger pointing to be done here. Again, with what we've referenced before, with the trouble at home with the Carthaginian power base basically tying Hannibal's one hand behind his back, and Hannibal was just simply. He was just out operationed basically by Scipio, and there was nothing he could do. And honestly, the initiative of war was probably lost about halfway through the establishment of Hannibal's power base. After the Fabian strategy had been introduced, and it was more about a strategy of containment and harassment, that's really at the point where Hannibal just couldn't do anything with decisive offensive initiative.
Now, what's interesting, if we look at the overall trends and arcs of the Second Punic War, I think a couple interesting trends are apparent. One is, why was Hannibal the Great such an implacable enemy of the Barcas? It's not like you could go to war with Rome and be like, well, sorry guys, just kidding, psych, let's make a peace treaty. That's not how the Romans work. Like, you spread fire and sword in Italy, Rome is going to have its pound of flesh, whether you oppose the war or not. Once the war is initiated, you should have supported Hannibal. I think the reason why Mega or Hanno was such an implacable enemy of the Barca clan was as he represented the older aristocratic merchant classes, and the Barcas represented a more populist, classical Greek tyrant model, like, say, Dionysus and Agathocles of Syracuse. He viewed them as a threat to the very constitution and republic of Carthage. And so if you view Hannibal and his family, his house, as that level of an existential threat, then, as the saying goes, the enemy within is always more dangerous than the enemy without. So one could easily envision Hanno viewing, well, the Romans are just one other enemy we have to fight. They're like the Greeks. We fought the Greeks for hundreds and hundreds of years. That's not a new change in the global strategy, but the Barcas are new. And that might be one way of explaining Hanno's implacable nature. It also might explain why the Carthaginians in Africa had such a large army to work with, because Hanno's estates and property were likely under threat by Scipio's army. And it's like, well, now that his property's on the line, Hannibal's got to come back. Gisco gets the army he actually needs, so on and so on and so on. In fact, Hannibal's army at Zama was larger than at any point after Cannae. So it's like he finally gets what he needs, but only because Africa was threatened. And by that point, it's too late. The other thing we see is that while we mentioned in the Rise of Rome, the Italian series, that Livy points out that early on in the battle against the Etruscans and the Samnites and the Latins, Roman cavalry was actually quite effective. And a lot of the early victories were due to spirited leadership of aristocratic generals and their cavalry. We see that the Romans finally have carved out a niche for themselves as cavalry commanders. Lelelius in Ilipa, while the Carthaginians are still in complete control of the Numidian forces, Scipio is able to defeat the Numidians in head-to-head battle, which is really huge for the Romans. This is the first time the Romans beat the Numidians at their own game. They're good enough to beat them without having to have them. That being said, Scipio still would rather have them fight for the Romans than not. And Lelelius and Massinissa had been on opposite sides at Ilipa, are now on the same side from Utica on. And we see that, down the ages with, Caesar's Titus Labienus in the Gallic Wars, or Belisarius in his cataphracts, we see that Rome has already charted a course for bold, effective cavalry commanders, which, again, we don't really think of that with the Romans. We think of infantry and the legions and siege warfare. But really, beginning with the Second Punic War, they do create this precedent for bold, decisive leadership within the cavalry arm, which is what we don't often associate with the Romans. Also, we can point to the fact, again, that naval supremacy. Rome controlled the seas throughout the entire war. Rome got to send troops where they wanted to. Now, we don't want to exaggerate this. I mean, Gisco did invade Liguria. Hannibal did get some minor reinforcements in 215. So the real question is, was the lack of supply due to lack of navy or lack of support from Hanno? Because, I mean, if Mago could just land in Liguria and the Romans couldn't stop him, it does have you wonder, like, it was decisive, but has the decisive nature been somewhat exaggerated?
Right. There's sort of a complicated combination going on between the two, with Hanno's power back at home, as well as this decimated naval element of the Carthaginians. So, yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about this for a while and reading Livy, and it's just difficult to say. It's probably sometime around, honestly, even the year following the success at Cannae, where Hannibal's cavalry officer, I forget his name, had basically said, you know how to attain victory, but you don't know what to do with it. I mean, that's sort of I mean, that's a great summary of this war. Now, it's not that Hannibal didn't know how to exploit victory. It's just that he didn't have, again, he didn't have the support or the direct naval logistical path set up, or an artery, so to speak, between Carthage and his power base in Rome at Tarentum and Cannae and Numistro and other various places where he had set up his power base. But yeah, I don't know that it was necessarily one or the other, but it certainly, it certainly created this. It created a problem for all the Carthaginian forces involved. Now, there were various people in the Carthaginian Senate that were trying to, throw as much power and gold behind Hannibal as possible. But again, the wealthy merchant class and the landowners of the Bagradus Valley, who had gained their wealth from previous generations by naval trade, they wanted to, even when things were good, going well for them in the war, they were still expressing the desire to end the war because, they were basically looking after themselves and sort of this mercantile empire that they had set up. And, there was interest on the mercantile class or the merchant class to for military efforts to be taken more towards Sicily, because many of these people in Hanno's class wanted to retain or at least recapture places like Lilybaeum and other places in Sicily that was previously Carthaginian territory. There's also speculation about Corsica and Sardinia being regained, but these sort of secondary, tertiary objectives, those places were secondary and tertiary in the mind of Hannibal, because what he wanted was to completely disrupt the Roman Empire within their own interior, rather than kind of messing around in these sort of peripheral locations like Corsica, Sardinia, Sicily, and Malta, and things like that. So, it's. I'm trying to think of what else to say. One other thing I will say that's interesting is that after the decisive defeat of the Carthaginians, when Scipio Africanus returned to Rome, he was one of the most powerful figures within Rome itself due to this victory. Now, after a lot of political infighting had occurred, in Scipio's moderating, what I should say is that, Scipio's influence had diminished basically, and by 184 BC, now this is a bit further on into the future, he withdrew from public life in complete disgust from sort of the Roman domestic politicking at home, because he came home as like this Eisenhower type figure, but due to just a lot of unstable politics within Rome itself, he just left in disgust. So it's kind of ironic. He comes home this war hero, but then he's completely turned off by all the problems within the Senate.
I think the last thing to end with is a comparison of Scipio and Hannibal as commanders. Now, the grand strategy of both was actually quite similar, right? Hannibal wanted to break up the Roman alliance structure by peeling off, Italian, Latin tribes, Magna Graecia, which he was more successful there because that was a more recent addition to the Roman state, and then building an anti-Roman coalition with the other Greek states like Macedonia and the Celtic tribes and whatnot. Now, Scipio also saw the importance of breaking up Carthaginian power. He courted the Celtiberians in Spain. He then courted the Numidians in Africa. Now, ultimately, the Roman system was a more lasting and durable system in the sense that many of the Roman citizens and allied states were willing to suffer along with Rome, whereas the Celtic population in Spain was notoriously hostile to the Carthaginians due to the high-handed measures of Hamilcar, Hasdrubal the Fair, and later Hannibal himself. And Numidia, we know the Numidians hated the Carthaginians going as far back as the Mercenary War when they switched sides. So it took no great effort to bring these nations against Carthage. Whereas even with all of Hannibal's military prowess, most of the Roman allies stayed with Rome. And what that tells me is that the Roman system was just a better system. It offered more to people who were conquered, Because I mean, it's antiquity. You're going to get conquered. Just how is it going to work out? Are you going to be slaves, like in the Gauls in Spain or the Numidians in Africa, or are you going to be citizens and allies? I mean, this goes back to our earlier episodes on the rise of the Roman Republic. It's just a better deal. In antiquity, you had two choices. You either conquered or were enslaved. The Romans gave you a third choice. And it was because they gave you that third choice, they became this global power. Because nobody else offered a deal that good. You either became a slave or you conquered other people. And the Romans are like, well, you can be an ally, which can then then you can climb the ladder to full citizenship. And so ultimately, as Livy points out when we covered the alternative history of, what if Alexander invaded Italy? The system beats the individual. But to be fair, though, Scipio himself was no slouch. The student had learned from the master and defeated the master. He understood that you had to use innovative tactics, trick the enemy, attack the enemy unexpectedly, use bold flanking maneuvers, attack the enemy where he's least expected. So Hannibal crosses the Alps into Italy. He crosses over the Arno mountain in the marshes. Scipio attacks New Carthage, completely unexpected. Scipio attacks Utica, not entirely unexpected, but he takes these bold surprise moves. And so he also understands the importance of encircling with bold cavalry maneuvers, something the Romans earlier on in the war didn't seem to follow. And ultimately, when we see the final confrontation of the two generals, we see the sort of mature tactical developments of both generals, and Hannibal using what he has. He doesn't have the army he had in 218. He doesn't have all these Numidian horse. Many of his veterans are dead from, almost 2 decades in Italy. And, Polybius says, Hannibal more or less did the best anyone could have expected him to do under the circumstances. That being said,
I think we lost our fearless leader, Todd. I think what I'll try and do here is just kind of pick up where he was at. But I think towards the end of the Second Punic War, you see this interesting sort of lesson learning on the part of the Romans, specifically with Scipio, and how again, what I said earlier in the stream is that I don't know if there was exact copying of tactics on the part of Scipio to Hannibal, but there certainly was a lot of note taking. And along with that, the Romans simply were just too predictable, and that's why Hannibal was so successful, and how he campaigned to the southern portion of Italy. I mean, that's just completely unprecedented, starting his flanking maneuver from places like Saguntum, and then eventually past the Ebro River into Italy itself through the Alps with the hostile attacks from the Gaelic tribes. And then, of course, he sets up his power base. And so, this is one of the great questions that basically the two generals of the war. This is almost like a Montgomery versus a Rommel type of a comparison, or a Patton versus Rommel. There was just a lot of lesson learning on the part of the Romans, and the Romans had to do very similar Punic tactics, which is attacking people where they were least or attacking the Carthaginians where the Carthaginians were at least expecting it, and of course. I mentioned earlier too that Scipio returned to Rome as this war hero, but he was completely turned off by the sort of the political domestic atmosphere of Rome and left in complete frustration and disgust in 183 or 184 BC. Looks like Todd's made it back.
Can you hear me? There you go.
Yes, sir.
I don't know what happened, but in case this happens again, my internet seemed to go out for a moment. So go ahead and finish your thoughts, and then we'll wrap it up.
Oh, sure. I was just continuing what you were saying, that these two large personalities of Scipio Africanus and Hannibal. These are kind of larger than life figures, and it really is the World War II of antiquity. I was just mentioning how it was just like incredibly ironic that, just kind of reiterating that Scipio returns to Rome as this Eisenhower type figure, but then in sort of a hilarious, or not hilarious, but this interesting twist of irony, he, through the own some of these various internal contradictions and class struggles within Rome itself, he leaves in complete disgust. And just as a sort of a broader observation about life in antiquity in the Mediterranean world in general, I think we described this earlier, is that the Romans weren't, they weren't like these various dynasties in Egypt, or they weren't, they weren't the Assyrians. They weren't these other just brutal powers that subjugate populations of people and just see them as just slaves and subjects to be brutalized. The Romans understood that you can create a broader coalition and power base if you create a sort of a system of alliances between different peoples. And especially it was easier because while not all of the tribes in Italy, not all of them spoke Latin, there was certainly a shared sort of religious and sort of a racial component there that was shared. And so the Romans had an easier time, and somewhat linguistic as well. So they had an easier time creating sort of this broader coalition of city-states. And it just putting it plainly, that's just a much better system than anywhere else you could have found in the Mediterranean world. Places like, when you could look back to the Diadochi Wars, after Alexander had died in Babylon, all of the, places like Ptolemaic Egypt, these places were just so, Antigonus, these places were just unfortunately brutalized, and there was no system in place. None of these generals, none of these officers put themselves in the position of average people, and a lot of Greek officers would be, it's strange to read, old memoirs of them, or at least to be recounted by Livy and Xenophon and others, that they're surprised when people revolt. Well, if your boot, or if your throat is under the boot of some authoritarian type system, that's what happens. And now Romans, I will say, when I forget the name of the city, but when they decided with Hannibal and the city was taken back by the Romans, they slaughtered most of the population, and many of the local politicians, they drank themselves to death type of a thing, or they took poison before the Romans returned. But as long as you stayed loyal to Rome, there was sort of this path to citizenship. There was some social mobility. There was really no other model anywhere else in the Mediterranean world that offered this kind of social mobility.
Well, at that note, thanks again, Terminal Philosophy. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.